I'm doing a Great British Bake Off 2024 bake-along. Let's get into pastry week. This week's signature bake, Frangipane Tarts. Now, I don't know about you, but up until this week, I really couldn't have told you what Frangipane was, which meant we were in for an adventure. So to make my Frangipane tarts, I started off by bringing together my sweet shortcrust pastry. I actually used the recipe posted to Bake Off's Instagram for this, which was just cutting butter into flour, adding powdered sugar, salt, egg, and water, and then kneading together until a cohesive dough formed. This got wrapped up and then placed in the fridge to chill for at least 30 minutes. Once chilled, it was time to roll and cut out the dough. My lovely mother-in-law actually gifted me perforated pastry rings like 2 years ago that I had yet to use, but better late than never. Sorry, Steph. Anyway, I rolled out the dough, used the rings to cut out the tart bottoms, and then measured out the strips for the sides. Looking back on this, I probably didn't need to be as precise with my measurements here, but I was definitely nervous about how these shells were going to turn out, so I erred on the side of caution. I then pressed the strips into the inside of each ring, using the warmth of my fingers to close the side and bottom seams. To use a classic bake-off phrase, this was an incredibly fiddly process and took me much longer to do than expected. Mad respect to the bakers in the tent who have to do this with time pressure. Anyway, once everything was molded together, I cut off the excess hanging over the edge with a pastry knife and then popped these into the freezer. Now, I'm not one to let good pastry go to waste, so I took the scraps, sprinkled on some sugar, and then popped them into the oven to make pastry crust cookies, which were thoroughly enjoyed by my husband the next day. While the pastry shells froze, it was time to move on to the frangipane, which is essentially a spreadable paste made from nut flour, typically almond, and then butter, sugar, flour, and eggs that bakes into an almost cake-like texture. The reason I was most apprehensive about this bake was that I hate almond extract. Cannot stand the stuff. And I knew that typically that was the main flavor of frangipane. But luckily, the beauty of baking is that if you don't like something, sub it out for something else. So for my tarts, I opted for pistachio frangipane with just a dash of vanilla extract. And spoiler alert, it turned out much better than expected. Anyway, once the frangipane was all mixed together, I placed it in the fridge to chill while I baked off my tart shells, which excitingly kept their shape, but my pastry could have been thinner. C'est la vie. I scooped in a thin layer of frangipane, filling them up less than halfway, and then popped these back into the oven to bake until the frangipane had risen and everything was golden brown. I removed the pastry rings and then transferred these to a wire rack to cool completely while I prepped the toppings. My topping inspiration came from what I happened to have in my fridge at the moment, which was some mascarpone, which turned into mascarpone whipped cream, and then some raspberry jam that I had made for the Biscuit Week Viennese whirls. Go watch that video if you want to see how it's made. Anyway, once the tarts had cooled, I spread on a layer of the raspberry jam, piped a border of mascarpone cream stars, added a fresh raspberry to the center of each tart, and then sprinkled on some chopped pistachios. And there we have it, my Pastry Week Raspberry Pistachio Frangipane Tarts. So looks-wise, I think I nailed this. Flavor-wise, I think there's room for improvement. I was really surprised by how little the pistachio came through in the frangipane, which I hate to say it might explain why the original recipes have you use extracts in addition to the ground nuts, but I might just need to find a different solve for that. The raspberry jam and mascarpone cream were delicious, but I think I was just expecting more from all of the components when they finally came together. It's good. Maybe a little underbaked on the pastry. I thought the frangipane would have a lot more flavor, and it's really more of just a textural element, so that's interesting and good to know. It's surprisingly light. I feel like I'm looking for flavor a little bit, whether it just needs more jam, more pistachio, more something, a little bit more salt somewhere, something to just really amp everything up. But I also really like my desserts and my flavors to really pack a punch. And this, again, is good, but not quite doing that. Overall, I'd say we definitely hit the brief of a frangipane tart, so success there. And I would make this again, with some tweaks, of course. But thank you so much for joining me for my Pastry Week bake, and I'll see you next week for Autumn Week.